So here we have the famous Fenian Church, also known as John's Lane Church, because John's Lane is the name of the laneway that surrounds it in a sort of a horseshoe shape. Its official name is the Church of St. John the Baptist and St. Augustine. But interestingly, the guy who sculpted the statues at the very top of the spire was a guy called James Pearce. Now, those of you familiar with Irish history will know that two of the Irish patriots who fought in the 1916 Rising were subsequently executed were Patrick and Willie Pearce. And their father was in fact an Englishman, a man from Bloomsbury in London called James Pearce. So James Pearce was a follower of Charles Bradlaugh, who was a very liberal thinker, sort of agnostic thinker in late 19th century England. And Pearce was a very talented sculptor. He studied art in college. He became a sculptor, travelling up and down England, generally making religious statues for his living. And ironically, he was an atheist, would you believe? So he moved to Ireland in 1857 at the age of only 18. And after the death of his first wife, he married an Irish lady called Margaret Brady. And it was with Margaret Brady that he had the two sons, Patrick and Willie Pearce. Now, it was believed that Pearce didn't go to church on a Sunday. And that was frowned on by Catholic and Protestants alike here in Dublin in the late 1800s. In fact, not only that did he not go to church, he actually was known to work on a Sunday, which was considered bad form. And not only that, there were mysterious pamphlets appearing in Dublin in the late 1800s under the pen name Humanitas, which asked questions such as, is God the first cause? And another pamphlet was called The Follies of the Lord's Prayer, and they're believed to have been the work of James Pearce. So, rather alarming if you were a devout Catholic or Protestant, but there you go. So this is the tallest church in Dublin, designed by Edward Pugin and his Irish brother-in-law George Ashland, and completed in 1915. So it took something like 53 years to build. Right guys, so let's just move a little bit down the street here. So we have a typical Irish pub here. This is Tom Kennedy's. I'll just give you a better view of this. Those of you who don't understand Gaelic, allow me to translate for you. There's a slogan here in Gaelic. If you look at this, Glock bug on sale, agus glocky on sale bug too. So that means in Gaelic is take life easy and life will go easy on you. Beautiful language. Gaelic is called the language of kings. With good reason, I believe. Beautiful language. Sadly, only 35,000 people speak it as a first language nowadays. So guys, we're heading down towards St. Catherine's Church. Okay. Now, St. Catherine's Church is famously the location where Robert Emmet was martyred. He was the leader of the 1803 rebellion. Robert Emmet gave a very daring speech from the dock when he was condemned to death. He was absolutely fearless. And it's a matter of record that Nelson Mandela, or Madiba as he's fondly known to South Africans, when he was on trial in South Africa, he fully anticipated the death penalty. And he had learnt off Robert Emmet's speech from the dock by heart, so that he could give a sort of a paraphrased speech when he was condemned to death. Fortunately, he wasn't condemned to death, and he ended up being the first leader of South Africa on independence. Across the road here is the National College of Art and Design, which was in its day Power's whiskey distillery. And this was the most modern whiskey distillery in the world in the 1880s, the first whiskey distillery in the world with its own bottling plant. So this is now the National College of Art and Design. Let's just move a little bit further on, guys. So the story of Robert Emmet is a rather romantic one. He was a little bit unrealistic. He only had about 90 followers. He had about 90 followers and he staged a single-handed revolution against English rule. And of course, needless to say, he was unsuccessful. He was the last person to be beheaded in Ireland. So beheading wasn't necessarily the execution method of choice in the British Isles. Hanging was generally the method, or shooting, or burning at the stake in cases of witchcraft, or hanging, drawing and quartering. But beheading was reserved largely for Robert Emmet because he was a follower of the French Revolution. And this is what had happened, the aristos, the aristocrats of the French Revolution. I suppose it was a way of the law making a rhetorical comment at him. Well, if that's what you advocate, that's what we're going to do to you. Now, sadly, beheadings weren't always a simple affair because a clean cut wasn't always made. And there was a tradition going back to Charles I in England, who was executed at the behest of Cromwell, that you had to tip the executioner or he would make a mess of the execution. So it's very important to leave tips, guys. Just you might like to remember that. But this is the location right beside St. Catherine's Church where Robert Emmet gave his life in the cause of Irish independence. And it was a rather gory affair. I won't go into the details. So St. Catherine's Church is one of those churches that architecturally sits astride two eras. It's not quite Georgian, and it's not quite, 17th century either. So it's a very old church built towards the end of the 1600s and in the early 1700s. So we'll just have a quick look at it down here. And there's a dedication, a memorial dedicated to Robert Emmet and to the efforts he made for Irish independence. Okay, this way. So St. Catherine's is a Church of Ireland church. It's Anglican or it's Episcopalian if you are in the United States. And I'll just stand back a little bit so you can get an eyeful of the elegant architecture. The only problem with this building architecturally is the stonework. The stone they're using is rather dark. It's not like the Portland stone that is used for other buildings in Dublin. It's rather dark and it gives a slightly forbidding air. Nonetheless, it is a beautiful piece of architecture. St. Catherine's Church of Ireland Chapel. Now down here we have a dedication to Robert Emmet, which I will show you. And it will give an account of when he gave his life for Irish freedom. So here we have it. Can you see that, folks? Robert Emmet died in the cause of Irish freedom on the 20th of September 1803 outside this church. Now the Emmet family were quite an illustrious family. Robert Emmet's brother, Thomas Addis Emmet, emigrated to the United States after the death of his brother. He became the Attorney General for the state of New York between 1812 and 1813. And Thomas Emmet's descendants are a long line of decorated veterans in US Navy history. In fact, that name Emmet is a very illustrious name in the history of the United States Navy. So there you go. Right, guys, we have a very important destination to visit. And that destination is the Guinness Brewery. So we're just going down this little roadway here. And in fact, the pub very appropriately is named Arthur's, obviously after Arthur Guinness, the progenitor, the patriarch of the Guinness business and family. Okay, we're just walking down here, folks. And we'll turn to the right down what's called Rainsford Street. And we'll approach the brewery from Rainsford Street. Interestingly, the Guinness is never owned, and they still don't own the ground on which the brewery was built. They simply signed a 9,000-year lease. So I know that's a long time to have the lease, and a few thousand years from now, one of the Rainsford family can approach them and basically evict them off their site. But I think they've made enough money between now and then to be quite happy with their piece of business. So the Rainsfords actually own the land on which the Guinness Brewery is founded. The Guinnesses do not own it, would you believe? They're simply renting it. To the left here, guys, is, before we go down to the brewery, something rather forbidding. It is the graveyard of St. Catherine's. I'll just show you the graveyard here. Again, a very sad place, and I'll tell you why, because this was the graveyard that was used by the founding hospital of Dublin. And, you know, you might ask yourself, what went on in the Middle Ages when women had more children than they could support? when women were involved in relationships which are coercive. A great many children were born. There was far less money or resources to feed those children. And what were people going to do? Well, those children were committed to a foundling hospital and they were effectively euthanized. So they were euthanized with the use of something called laudanum, which was heroin or opium suspended in alcohol. What a thing to give a baby. And this drug was administered to babies over a period of a couple of weeks, and they were very gradually euthanized. So it is reckoned up to 250,000 babies were buried in this ground and in neighbouring burial grounds. 250,000 babies buried in this area. Quite shocking. Okay, guys, let us go down to the Guinness factory, Guinness Brewery. Okay, can you see the famous logo in the distance? The black gate in the distance there. That is one of the most famous brands in the world, I think it's fair to say. The Guinness brand. So it's a golden harp on a black background. And with the brand Guinness written on it. Guinness is set up in 1759, but when they initially set up, they were only selling ordinary ales. They weren't selling the famous black-coloured drink that we all know and love. However, Arthur Guinness went on business to London in 1777, and while there he visited a pub which was trying a new type of beer. It was a new type of beer which included barley, and of which part of the barley was roasted to a very high temperature, effectively burned, and then put into the drink, giving the drink a very dark colour and quite a distinctive flavour. And this particular drink was very popular with hotel porters. They seemed to be the people who identified with the drink and who had a fondness for it. So the drink became known as porter. So Arthur Guinness was very impressed with this drink and felt it had potential, but with his very keen marketing sense, he reckoned something was missing. And he reckoned this drink would be a big hit if it simply had a higher level of alcohol. A considerably higher level of alcohol. So he came back to Dublin, he knew what he had to do. He starts making porter in Dublin, but he starts making extra stout porter. That is porter with a much higher level of alcohol. There's a linguistic conundrum here to be explained to you guys, and that is that in the language of the 1700s, stout meant high in alcohol. So if I gave you a wine that was high in alcohol, I'd be giving you a stout wine. If I gave you a whiskey that was extra high in alcohol, I'd be administering a stout whiskey to you. So Arthur Guinness created an extra stout porter. That's what he called his drink. Now over time, the word extra was dropped, and so too was the word porter, and you end up with the word stout. So stout is basically 2 steps removed from regular beer in that it has roasted barley in it, which gives it a dark colour, and it also has a higher level of alcohol, and that is Guinness. And that was the winning formula, if you like. So by 1838, barely 50 years after he had started producing the drink, Guinness were the top brewery in Ireland, and in 1886 they became the top brewery in the world, producing 2 million barrels of their famous stout every year. Guinnesses were a very good employer to the people of Dublin. They looked after their workers. It was not obligatory under Irish law to give holiday pay until 1945, but Guinnesses gave 2 weeks holiday pay from the late 1890s onwards to all workers. They also gave sick pay. They had their own health insurance plan as well, and they even had their own fleet of ambulances. So if you were a Guinness family, that is to say a family that had somebody working in the Guinness factory, and if there was an emergency at home, you could actually phone the Guinness ambulance. And right up to the early 1960s, you could see these black-coloured ambulances racing through the streets of Dublin with the Guinness harp on the side, sirens blaring, and of course people joked that, you know, an Irish pub had run out of Guinness and that qualified as an emergency. Well, in fact, it was actually, you know, a member of the Guinness staff was actually in need of medical help, and that's why that ambulance was racing its way through the streets. Now, Guinness continues to be a hugely successful drink worldwide. It is made now in 50 different countries, and it's drunk in over 120 countries. The country that drinks the most Guinness is actually the UK. Second after that is Ireland. And in third position after that is, believe it or not, Nigeria in Africa. In fourth position is the United States, and in fifth position is Cameroon. So I think that surprises a lot of people, but I think African people either identify with the blackness of the drink, feel that it's their drink in some way, it has some providential relevance to them, or it may be simply exactly the sort of thing you need to drink in the heat of darkest Africa. Who's to say? Maybe it slakes your thirst rather well. But 40% of the world's Guinness is drunk in the dark continent in Africa, believe it or not. Right, guys, I just want to take you down the street and actually show you the home of Arthur Guinness. Now, Arthur Guinness was wealthy enough himself, but in point of fact, by the standards of the day, he wasn't wealthy enough. And he married rather well into the Whitehouse family. Olivia Whitehouse is the lady he married. And they had 23 children, would you believe? Only 9 of whom survived to adulthood. So can you imagine how arduous life was for women in those days, even aristocratic women, that really they had very little say in their own fertility and so forth. And for a woman to give birth 23 times is quite extraordinary. But I think that what is more traumatic perhaps still is to only see 9 of those offspring make it to adulthood. Nonetheless, we're just going to walk down this little lane right here. Guinnesses have been so successful, their success basically can be attributed to 2 things. Arthur Guinness's marketing nous to start with, but secondly, their advertising, because Guinnesses have used the most clever advertisers in history. They've spent a fortune, and it has paid huge dividends for them, hiring the most skillful, the most crafty, the most intelligent, and the most quirky advertising agencies. They've had some very clever advertising campaigns, and that accounts for a great deal of their success. So we're coming back onto Thomas Street here, and we're just going to visit the ancestral home of the Guinness family, which is just to the left after this stop sign. Okay. So the Guinness family home is coming up. Let me show it to you guys. It's this big Georgian doorway here. Now have a look. I'll just go vertical with the camera to show you. So there you go, a Georgian doorway with fanlight and so forth. You have the buffalo skulls above the fanlight there. You have a typical black Georgian door there. The door knocker is one of the river gods. The river gods were associated with the city of Dublin. And here to the right we have a plaque, a dedicatory plaque that commemorates the Guinness family having lived here. So the dwelling place of Arthur Guinness, master brewer and founder in 1759 of the company that bears his name. There you go. Okay. Now we're just going to cross the street. We're going to see the original St. James's Gate. Okay, this is the entrance of the Guinness factory. And on the left they have the year 1759, the year in which the brewery was founded. And on the right they have the current year, which is 2022. So just give me a second to cross the street, guys. We'll get a good bird's eye view of this. Bear with me a second. Off to the right there, guys, as you can see, is Rowe and Company. That is actually property of the Guinness family, believe it or not, because the Rowe Whiskey Distillery was the biggest whiskey distillery in the world in the 1800s. Unfortunately, it fell upon hard times because the Rowe family were reluctant to modernise. So they ended up using more expensive methods to make their whiskey. And secondly, prohibition in the 1920s in the United States more or less put paid to about half of their market. So they went under in the early 1930s. But Guinness has bought the right to the name, and they bought some of their old lands and factory buildings. And believe it or not, the Guinnesses have, in recent years, revived the Rowe brand. So Rowe whiskey is being distilled once more, would you believe? Okay, just bear with me a second. Okay, can you see the gate there? It's St. James's Gate, so to speak. That is the famous Guinness address. So we'll just have a quick look at that. I'll just cross over in a second. So this is it. This is the St. James's Gate that is used as the address of the Guinness industrial concern. Guinnesses are now known as Diageo. That's their modern name, Diageo, D-I-A-G-E-O. And in fact, the term St. James's Gate was famous long before the Guinnesses came here. Believe it or not, it was famous right back into the 1100s, because St. James's Gate traditionally is the gathering point for pilgrims who are going to go on the Camino. That is the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain. So people went from all over Christendom in the early Middle Ages to Santiago de Compostela, most chiefly seeking a cure for leprosy, because leprosy was endemic in Europe in the early Middle Ages, and it was believed that St. James was the patron of lepers, and he had the power to heal leprosy. And there was a church in honor of St. James that named after him in Santiago de Compostela, San Tiago being the Spanish for St. James, or Tiago being a nickname for James. So in fact, people used to make the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. They would gather at the old St. James's Gate, which was an old tower gate that was here till 1734. So it was demolished only 25 years before Guinnesses actually came here. And that is where people traditionally gathered to start off the Camino. They would walk together down to the ship, they would get on the ship, go to Spain, and then they would actually make the Camino proper, do the 150 kilometre walk from somewhere in northern Spain to the city of Santiago de Compostela. Nowadays, if you're making the pilgrimage to northern Spain, you still go from St. James's Gate, but more particularly, you go from St. James's Church, which is just around the corner. It's not within sight, but it's just further 100 metres down the road around that corner. So people are still making the Camino. In fact, there's been a revival of interest in the Camino in recent years. Now, would you believe, even as I speak, I'm getting the smell of barley from Guinnesses. So that's the good news. They're still making Guinness here in Dublin. Dublin is one of the 50 different locations worldwide where Guinness is still made. I don't think they make a large proportion of it here, but they do make a certain amount of Guinness here. I just want to show you one last thing. Remember I spoke to you about Guinness's reviving the Rowe family distillery. Now, the Rowe distillery started 2 years before Arthur Guinness even came to St. James's Gate. They started in 1757, but they started in a time when nobody had electric power. Also, the situation of the Rowe distillery was they weren't anywhere near the city watercourse. They couldn't actually derive hydropower to drive their mills, or to grind the grain and so forth, so they needed another type of power. They needed wind power. And would you believe, in 1757 the Rowe family built what was then, and what still is today, the world's largest windmill. I kid you not, guys. So just follow me this way and I will show it to you. You're about to see the world's largest windmill. Now, it was decommissioned in the 1930s when Rowe's went bankrupt, and they took down the sails. So you're going to see a windmill that has no sails on it. Nonetheless, it is still officially the world's largest windmill to this very day. Have a look here, guys. Can you see that? That is called St. Patrick's Tower, and that is the biggest windmill in the world. It's 42 meters in height. It's what's called a smock windmill. The second biggest windmill in the world is in Schiedam in the Netherlands, and that is 33 meters high. And the next highest after that is in Lincolnshire in the UK, and it's 27 meters high. So that is quite some claim to fame. So no offense to you Dutch people out there who might be looking in, but this is actually the biggest windmill in the world, would you believe? Okay, guys, I'm going to leave it at that. It's been really nice showing you around the Liberties. So if you have any questions, put them in comments. And as I say, I will perhaps add to this video a little bit, or perhaps revise it at some point in the future. Lovely talking to you. Take care, and I'll see you on my next video. Thank you.